Welcome to Live Players, where political scientists and strategists Samo, Burja, and I discuss the key individuals with the power to alter our current society. Every week, we provide analysis of the news and case studies of live players as well as key institutions and technologies that make up the global power landscape. Let's dive in.
Let's get into Boeing. So why don't you unpack what happened for folks who missed the whole saga there, and then we'll get into why that matters and what's going on with the company and the broader space.
The most substantive problem of Boeing is that their planes crash and kill people. In late 2018 and 2019, two of Boeing's new jetliners fatally crashed, killing a combined 346 people. Since then, there's been a string of high-profile but non-lethal incidents, including like an airline door blowing off mid-flight, right? Where there was then, as a result, an injury. There was no fatality, but this starts to cast doubt on two things. First, Boeing's ability to design new aircraft that are actually quite good. That is because the two crashes were both due to a significant software glitch of some kind, and they were both on the new aircraft, the 787. Right, the so-called Dreamliner, which is supposed to be the more fuel-efficient, modernized offering that Boeing could provide. The high-profile accidents, like the doors blowing off and things like that, that suggests there is a problem of maintenance. And there's a problem with, the quality of producing even well-established models of the aircraft. So if you have a major, commercial aircraft manufacturer, and it is, of course, in some ways still big goal aircraft manufacturer, right? It is one of the only two companies in the world that can produce jumbo jets. These are wide-bodied civilian aircraft that can accommodate hundreds of passengers for long-haul flights of over 10,000 kilometers, right? So the long-haul flights are important to go straight from destination to destination. It's it makes the international travel and any sort of cross-continent tourism or business travel easier. It's there to satisfy that demand, especially between big hubs between London and Dubai or London and San Francisco and so on. The other company is Airbus. We can talk about Airbus a little bit in this episode, but maybe we'll focus on them in a later episode because it's a fascinating story of a actually, successful and functional European multinational industrial partnership. But the importance of Boeing is even more fundamental than just the civilian aircraft industry. It's not just a champion of American aerospace and high technology. Let's remember, Boeing used to be a leader in space technology. I think I say used to be because it was part of the United Launch Alliance. It still is. It's very clear to me that, and I think to most observers, that SpaceX has long surpassed Boeing as a contributor to the cutting edge of aerospace. Maybe not exactly in all niche applications, but certainly for any kind of involvement with launch vehicles. Still, there is also the aspect of U.S. dominance of airspace. There is a way that, Boeing's decline is a blow to U.S. prestige and air power. Air power is just a key to U.S. military superiority worldwide, and Boeing is key to U.S. military air power. Across the U.S. Armed Services, aircraft developed or maintained by Boeing represent an estimated 37% of all fixed-wing and rotary aircraft. 41 the Air Force aircraft, 43 for Marine Corps, 37 is the overall general number. And I think it's something like 39 for the Navy and 30 for the Army. So really, you can't imagine Boeing decaying in the civilian sector, sort of, and this not also be a warning sign for U.S. military capabilities, right? There's an interesting way in which, we test the commercial aircraft a lot. The military aircraft have the advantage of, there's no high-profile death of passengers. There might be death of pilot, but it's still, it's sort of the case that the military incidents are also not promoted as much. However, if it came to an actual war, right, you can't really hush up hundreds of aircraft failing under combat flight circumstances, what they were ostensibly designed for, rather than just doing test flights or training flights and so on. And there are indicators, and some of these, of course, might be in a problem in the Navy or the Air Force or the Army, of like, some incidents where aircraft, Boeing military aircraft, have failed or near failed in dubious circumstances, and it was the skill of the pilots that sort of saved the aircraft. So this is the case of what used to be like a company that was at the peak of US prestige, frontier of the future, right? The jet age in the 1960s, Boeing was like creating that. It was actually crushing competition worldwide in a fair, even playing field, right? European countries were concerned over US dominance of commercial airlines in the 60s, which is why they sort of formed Airbus. But this was a company that pushed the frontier, the envelope. It became prestigious. It supported the space age. It supported US aerospace power. And now it, I think, is failing to develop new commercial aircraft. It is trying merely to cut costs, not to innovate. And we can get into why they're in the mindset of just cutting costs rather than the mindset of, hey, what can we do in our organization to restart innovation? Because innovation used to be our business, right? So it's kind of like a deep case study in the relative stagnation of US aerospace. Sort of the only exciting thing that has happened has been SpaceX.
Yeah. Would this be the equivalent of if in a few decades SpaceX no longer is functioning well and becomes this bureaucratized sort of shell of itself?
And a Starship 7 or whatever the model is, or Starship Model S or whatever, starts crashing out of the sky and, maybe kills hundreds of passengers on a suborbital flight. Yeah, it is the equivalent, right? It's hard. We often think of these companies as, oh, of course, this is a dinosaur. Of course, this is like a lumbering bureaucratic giant. Of course, it has these like corrupt, cushy government deals that aren't effective. But that's not the origin of any of these organizations, right? Like Boeing was the pride and joy of US engineering prowess. It was the pride and joy of US R&D. It was success of US capitalism. In a way, it successfully commercialized the military side, right? One way to think about mass air transit, I'm going to say something relatively provocative. I'm going to say we might never have had the jet age were it not for World War II. Why? World War II accelerated the development of new propulsion technologies, such as the jet engine. It also created a massive aerospace infrastructure, a demand to produce so many planes that per unit, planes got pretty cheap. And then when the war is over, sure, is the Cold War. There's the threat of a war with the Soviet Union. But all of these companies looked at the economics again, and they were like, wait, these giant contracts where we had to build hundreds or thousands of planes, they actually made it cheap enough for us to offer larger, faster civilian transports. And the economics actually work out. Now, when you see this sort of photo of the 1960s airline cabin, right? You've seen the photo where it's like comfy, you have leg room, everyone's dressed in a suit, they serve food, all of that, right? It feels like luxurious by modern standards. There is some truth to that. In economy, at least, the economy section of a plane, people are packed a little bit more like sardines. But it's also good to remember that once you adjust for inflation, in the 1960s, every ticket was a business class ticket, right? Like it was way more expensive to fly, relatively. It also was the case that the TSA was not yet a factor, and airports were much freer. Like you could go into an airport and meet someone at the gate, much as you might meet them at a train station, right? And you could board a plane without extensive screening procedures. In fact, this was kept as a convention, even as aircraft were being abducted left and right. Did you ever hear about the 1970s spring of airplane hijacking?
No. didn't hear that.
In 1970s, dozens of planes were hijacked by people who basically demanded ransom money. And, they would then redirect the plane, to a place like Cuba or somewhere. Or they would even do theatrical things like, try to do a parachute jump out of the plane. There's like one particular infamous case, where a hijacker just, jumped out of the plane and was never found. It's not clear whether they died or whether they escaped. It makes full story. I'm going to have to look up the name. I think it's, let me see if I have the guy's name. D.B. Cooper hijacking. So this was in 1971. Nondescript man calling himself Dan Cooper approached the counter of, the airlines company in Oregon and just demanded basically a flight somewhere. So anyway, things like this, and he was never caught, right? He had like a big suitcase of money, etc., that maybe he escaped with. The convenience was there at the airport itself. And I think, if we had to have the kind of security procedures at boarding that we do today, I think airlines might have never become as entrenched as a normal way to live life. There's often this thing that people forget, which is that, way we treat convenience is most important when you're trying to train people to a new behavior. But once they're used to behavior, such as like, we go on a plane to visit family that lives like at the other side of the country, or we go on a plane to, vacation in Italy because we want to do the same thing our neighbors did. Once that behavior is there, then new regulation doesn't necessarily change that aspiration or desire quickly. It changes it very slowly. But, that first, at least, that sort of behavior is there. So why am I going so deeply into how deeply inconvenient and how much longer the airport experience is? If I go to an airport, it might be, if we call it an experience, it's almost a euphemism, right? It's like an hour and a half of your time, right? Unless you're flying private. If you're flying private right now with, service like JSX or some other sort of ride sharing for private jets, you're actually getting an experience that's more similar to 1960s commercial air travel, right? And you might not even realize it. And in that case, you don't need to spend an hour and a half at the airport. You might be there 20 minutes. That might be it. And you might even have a lay for your car, whatever, right? It's like a nice experience. The cost of fuel has risen. Especially it rose in the 1970s again. So you have then these two sort of headwinds. First, price of fuel rose in the 1970s oil fuel crisis, sort of the energy crisis the US entered. This closed off the future of supersonic flight, where travel could be even faster because energy was cheap. Second, the hijackings did not actually affect people as much as 9/11 did 30 years later, but that added further limits on travel and made the aircraft didn't get any worse, but the airports got vastly worse as a consequence of needing to sort of fortify them against terrorism, where the purpose of hijacking a plane is to smash it into a building as a missile rather than to hijack it demanding a ransom, right? It became less like crime and more like actual terrorism. The concern and why it needed to be fortified against that. And then the third headwind was COVID itself, where it sort of reset traveling experiences and expectations. Now, some vacation destinations have recovered, Italy, Turkey, but a lot of business class travel went away, never to return. And today, actually, business class and first class and a lot of these flights subsidize the rest of the flight, right? Like you kind of can make money more easily on some of the more premium seats compared to the sort of mass economy aspect. However, this means that the classic model of commercial flight not only has seen stagnation in the number of, basically people using it in developed countries such as the United States. So there's no, it's very difficult to imagine a situation where outside of great technological innovation, you would have an extra 50 million or 100 million yearly air travelers in the United States, right? Passengers traveling from one corner to the other. That's difficult to imagine. You have a situation where every plane is getting more expensive, even if it's the same exact design. You have this, backstock of orders that you supplied. The airlines maintain their aircraft for a very long time. They order planes to replace the old aircraft at a slow rate. So maybe the total number of planes you're producing is actually smaller than when the stock got first built. And around the world, there are, of course, new markets where you can sell. That's why in sort of commercial aircraft, it has to be a global market, because there's always, or at least there has been for the last 50 years, there's always some new part of the world that got into the habit of flying. Either, again, business travel or for tourism reasons. And you have to market and sell there. And as sort of the economics of commercial air travel at the scale that we currently have don't quite make sense, I think there should, by default, without other technological progress, there would be kind of like an air travel recession sort of in the Western world, because fewer people travel because the habits broke during COVID. Energy costs are lower than the 70s, certainly higher than they were 10 years ago, especially in Europe. The airplane demand sort of isn't there to keep on building, dozens or hundreds, or many hundreds of aircraft. And it's tricky to consider. It takes like very long-term planning to try to develop a new plane, right? It takes long-term planning right now because there's no like explosion of possible new customers where you could, bootstrap the economies of scale needed to make an aircraft cheap. The specs of like a military aircraft and a civilian one have also diverged pretty deeply compared to the 1950s. 1950s, you could still think of a jet bomber and a jet passenger plane. It's having like not too dissimilar characteristics. Wide-bodied plane that has to deliver like a large payload of bombs that just drops down. Like, okay, we replace the bombs with passenger seats, and that kind of works. I'm simplifying, but there was like a genuine similarity there in the requirements.
Hey everybody, Erik here with a word from our sponsors. If you don't already subscribe to Turpentine's industry-leading newsletters, like our new daily AI newsletter, Emergent Behavior, or Media Empires, you should. But that's not what I'm here to tell you about. The platform we use to power these newsletters is called Beehiiv, and it's excellent. First of all, it was started by the same early team who helped build Morning Brew into a $75 million newsletter business. And they built Beehiiv to offer that same powerful functionality to anyone sending emails. From essayists to business owners, the platform is beautiful, their text editor is intuitive, and they help you scale your audience with custom growth features. Beehiiv has powerful tools to help you monetize your content. You can easily launch paid subscriptions or pursue an advertising model. The Beehiiv platform will even connect you to premium brands to sponsor your newsletter. Not only do we use them, but thousands of the top newsletters in the world also use them, like Milk Road, Blockworks, the Lindy newsletter, and so many more. Beehiiv's founder hooked up Moment of Zen listeners with a sweet deal. Get 20% off for 3 months with code MOZ. Visit beehiiv.com, that's BEEHIIV.com, to get started. The tech world turns to the Brave browser for its unbeatable privacy protections. But did you know that Brave also has a private ad platform? Brave Ads offers first-party targeting, and it's been cookieless since day one, so you can relax while third-party tracking cookies disappear from the web. Today, millions of people turn to ad blockers to avoid being tracked and pestered online. But Brave's new ad model aligns incentives for users and advertisers. Users earn rewards for viewing ads, which they can save, spend, or pass along to their favorite creators. And advertisers score points for respecting user privacy, generating ROI without invasive tracking. So whether it's high-impact announcements on the new tab page or keyword-targeted ads in Brave Search, Brave Search offers diverse, private, future-proof ad formats for all your business goals. Join the future of advertising at brave.com/ads. Mention Turpentine to get 25% off your first campaign.
The question is, will Boeing have a decent future if it has given up on developing new aircraft? One of the lessons it sort of took from 787 has been that it should perhaps not pursue even such conservative new designs and just stick to building replacements for, the current fleet of aircraft like 747s and so on. But in that future, I think that they will have severe difficulties. Two reasons. One, Airbus did not take the same lesson. So Airbus continues to try to develop new commercial aircrafts at a slow and bureaucratic pace. So this is not startup pace innovation. And even if some of them fail, as long as they don't fail, if they fail economically, such as the A380, which is kind of, not a success for Airbus, as long as they don't fail in the sense of, crashes or, accidents, the airline has basically purchased lottery tickets, right? Eventually, Airbus will just make a plane that is better than the vintage Boeing planes in the commercial space. And unless we engaged in very heavy protectionism on the US side, that would just mean that, they would buy more Airbus planes. I, in fact, already have friends who, because of the reputation damage of Boeing, just have kind of like a no Boeing flying principle. They just go out of their way to check before booking a flight what the model of the plane is going to be, which is, pretty funny. The real threat, though, I think is more from the Chinese attempt to enter commercial airline space, because China is a country that has become very wealthy, or at least it has parts of it that are very wealthy. And if you look at tourists at any major tourist destination, you realize, wait, there's a lot of Chinese tourists, right? And of course, there's a lot of Chinese business travel because it's the world's factory. Also business travel now, thanks to Belt and Road and other similar initiatives, to basically every corner of the planet, not just where their customers might be in Europe or the United States. As a result, the demand for air travel is still going up in China. Americans fly notably more than Europeans and more than Chinese. But the commercial passenger market in China will eventually be bigger than that in the United States. And then, if this buildup of a stock of planes to meet this demand were to come from a Chinese company, I think in that case, planes they designed would be modern in a deep sense, right? They would be redesigns from scratch. Maybe they would start by copying the other aviation industry stuff, but the domestic market. And secondly, the very deep industrial base, which allows them to build everything in basically a single location, two locations. I think this might be a crushing advantage that Airbus would struggle with, but could wipe out Boeing's commercial airline business. I don't think they're thinking about that as a possible scenario on the 10 to 20 year timescale, but I think they very much should be. There's another way in which Boeing is a sign of US industrial decline. Part of it is a fractal succession failure within the company. I think that's actually the most fundamental problem. It is a fractal succession failure at the engineer level and the manager level. At the manager level, the only way to cut costs without innovating is to sort of fragment production facilities away from places that have kind of a unionized workforce or that have high labor costs, to build as many components as possible in places where it's cheap to build them. So you don't have kind of one facility becomes 5 or 6 facilities. This increases the communication cost and overhead between all of them, makes it organizationally more complex, even if it seems to improve margins. part of the reason why Boeing almost doesn't have a choice is that the industrial ecosystem, which caused it to make sense to have a single facility of Boeing doing business with a lot of other American manufacturers, is that those American manufacturers offshored already. So all these companies that used to be American companies that Boeing worked with that were sort of co-located manufacturing stuff in, I don't know, like a center like maybe LA, right? That's like a center of military aerospace. All of these came to do business with Chinese firms, and eventually it becomes very sensible to build something in China. Or you think to yourself, well, the reasons all our facilities were co-located here, they don't make sense anymore. Maybe we should disperse them. So it's almost an adaptation by Boeing's management to a deindustrialized US. The agglomeration effects and the benefit of co-location, various industries for each component has weakened decade after decade. The seeming financial rewards of globalization increased. And all of this sort of works as long as you still have the engineers that were trained together and work together. But eventually, inevitably, you have the cultural shear where there's a generation of engineers that were always across 5 plants rather than having formed and worked together as a single team at one plant and then disperse into 5. Like those 5 teams will just be 5 teams. They won't be a single team that is dispersed across 5 locations. You know, with all of these prospects, I think often the question is, where are you forming the replacement human capital? And at least in the United States, there are fewer and fewer places where Boeing could hire from for certain kinds of aerospace expertise too, or expertise in industry and manufacturing, or, you know, error reduction rates, right? If they want to hire an expert at reducing error rates in a production process, who exactly do they hire from the United States? Where was that big, complicated company, as complicated as Boeing, manufacturing some widget or the other, where they could get an expert? Well, they also can't get that in the US. They would have to again go to China, which is the place where large, complicated widget manufacturing processes live these days, which means that you have to train it in-house. But in-house training, that's so expensive. Like it is so difficult to create your own human capital in high precision industries. And the market's just, you know, it's not big enough for many American companies. There's kind of room, again, currently in the world, there's kind of room for 2 major commercial aircraft manufacturers, Boeing and Airbus. The US market is like not big enough for multiple of those. The only company I've seen that sort of has a different and interesting concept it is a specialist company. It's like, you know, Boom Supersonic. You probably know them.
Yeah. Starbucks raised a bunch of money and seems to have some promising technology, but I'm not close to it.
Yeah, they're basically betting on a kind of technological revolution where, you know, because fuel costs are lower than the 70s, because there have been advances and breakthroughs in aerospace, maybe we can return to that interrupted future of continuing growth of, you know, number of miles traveled. If you reduce the time that's needed for travel in theory becomes more convenient. People do more of it, either for business trips or for, you know, basically tourism and leisure. That's a problem that Boeing's not even really trying to tackle. Like they're not trying to build a supersonic plane, but it is plausible that company innovates in some niche applications for commercial supersonic, and then eventually all air travel becomes supersonic or close enough to it, and they disrupt Boeing. Like that's a possibility. I'm not saying Boeing will be disrupted by a US company anytime soon, but that would actually be an optimistic scenario for the United States. It will be optimistic because it means that a US company will be outcompeted by another US company, technology advances in the process, and the consumer experience is improved, rather than Boeing loses its international markets maybe even its domestic markets to sort of a Chinese competitor, in which case you might still have consumer benefit. However, it would just be another step in deindustrialization. And importantly, it will be one with national security implications. There's a fundamental way in which Boeing is like a dual use company, right? It secures US air travel, and in a way, US, civilian air travel subsidizes US air power because it does maintain some of the same facilities and sometimes even some of the same engineering teams.
Is it worth diving deeper into Airbus in terms of lessons that should be learned from it, or anything else that you think is worth sharing here?
I think that Airbus has a sufficiently different situation that the key advantage it has is that it has not fragmented its production. So it doesn't have, more locations to manufacture than it used to. It sort of did not try to reduce labor force costs. It basically tried to maintain them. And that's, maybe it's due to political constraints as much as design, because it is a partnership of several European governments. It is backed by several of the European governments and the companies there. But I don't think that, I think that until the recent energy crisis in Europe, it's still not talked of as an energy crisis, but it clearly is. Since the invasion of Ukraine, Germany and European countries like France and so on were doing actually a better job of avoiding deindustrialization than the United States. They would tend to do less offshoring, and when they did it, they maintained high precision manufacturing. There's still some remnants of this like deep industrial stack in Europe, ASML famously in the Netherlands, which in turn depends on a large number of medium-sized companies in the Netherlands and Germany. So I would say that, part of it is the European countries actually had better industrial policy, at least for preserving industry in conditions where you have to compete with China for a while. This is now no longer the case, but Airbus certainly benefited from it. And the second one is, I think that they understood that innovation in aerospace is almost always this sort of money-losing venture. It takes decades and decades to really figure out if it pans out or not. And I think at Boeing for the last 20 years, it's been a complacency where the view was, well, almost no matter what we do, we are going to have half of the market. And our golden advantage in a way is the backlog of orders. In 2023, Boeing manufactured 528 jets. It has a backlog of 6,189 aircraft, right? So that's in a way wonderful, right? If you're pacing your production, you have these back orders, you're just fulfilling these back orders. Why innovate? Yet over precisely these 2 decades, Airbus has slowly overtaken Boeing in commercial aircraft manufacturing. Airbus had delivered 35 aircraft and has a backlog of 8,598 planes. So even without like jumps in innovation from Airbus, which I illustrated earlier, we should fear both from China and less likely, but hopefully from startups that are trying to pursue technologies like supersonic. Boeing is slowly losing out this race versus Airbus, right? And I think the key lesson for Airbus might also be that Europe does invest more in maintaining high-end industrial expertise. So the human capital problem, because already the companies in Europe already are, let's put it this way, they're almost obliged to do certain things, right? They're obliged to stick to particular labor forces. almost as a side effect of that, they invest more in their labor. Why? Because when you invest more in a particular office of engineers, you invest more if you know that they're not going to leave. And it's kind of a negative that they're not going to leave. It suggests it's not a very competitive labor market. But just for dumb bureaucratic reasons, it's, well, you're stuck with your labor force. You might as well train them to be as effective as possible. And then you develop these aerospace capabilities, right? And I think that Airbus has sort of fallen into this kind of American school of MBA type thinking, where the people managing the company no longer have any engineering expertise. For cultural reasons, Airbus has many more people who have actual engineering expertise making relevant decisions. I think this is especially important in companies where the fault tolerance must be low. You cannot actually truly figure out how risky a cost-cutting decision is unless you understand the physical object, right? So if the problem is not serious from some fault with your product, you don't actually have to understand how it physically works. You can just like look at the pure economics of it and be like, well, we can cut costs this much. And, then we'll see if this increases our error rate too much. If it increases our error rate too much, we're just going to roll it back. Here, however, the aircraft is such a complex product that, I honestly think that a commercial aircraft is probably about as complicated as an orbital rocket. I think it's like quite comparable, right? So it's a very complicated machine. And what on paper looks like a sensible cost-cutting measure might, if you understand what it implies physically about the tolerances and the machine, and if you can understand what the engineers are telling you, might introduce disastrous risk. And, unlike rockets where they can blow up and it's actually part of the business plan because there are no passengers, it's absolutely terrible PR. Like the airline spent so long to convince people that it's safe to fly that it's honestly mildly catastrophic to have such high profile failures, right? It's like the whole meme of flying is the safest way to travel. Like that whole, mile per mile, you're actually safer on an aircraft than in a car. That was a concerted PR effort. Like you needed to convince people it's safe to fly. Flying is actually, a fear of flying is very natural for land-based mammals like we are as humans. It took a bit to convince us this is a good idea. If you give people reason to think that it's not a good idea, they fly less. I guarantee you that my friends who want to now fly Airbus rather than Boeing, but on the margin, they also just fly less. So spooking your customers results in a smaller market, might result in kind of this self-fulfilling prophecy, because the main reason to fly is, because everyone else flies. If everyone else in your corporation is flying to corporate headquarters for some sort of meeting, then all the branch offices have to put one of their guys or girls on the plane and go there. And if all your neighbors have vacation in Italy, well, you probably have to vacation in Italy too. But, once the norm is different, then, that sort of herd behavior goes away and then the economies of scale go away. Now, will these accidents end air travel? No. But I am talking about on the margin, every airline accident anywhere in the world has a negative impact on all air travel anywhere in the world, at least if it's widely reported. There is a perception of the industry safety overall. And again, there's this interesting thing with, some of the whistleblowers of Boeing and its legal troubles dying. People joke that it's Boeing assassins killing them. I think that's probably not true. The fact that it's so popular as a meme and an observation is actually also bad for Boeing, right? Like, at the very least, I think it produces culture where people won't want to whistleblow. They won't want to talk about serious liabilities and serious problems that are happening. There have been lots of incidents where people have been, having trouble making do with the cheaper labor force. Like there's reports of basically drug abuse problems in some of the manufacturing facilities. Right in 2011, the FBI and DEA raided a 5,000 person Boeing factory in suburban Pennsylvania. They were manufacturing, military helicopters, and charged 37 current and former Boeing employees with illegal possession and distribution of drugs, including fentanyl and prescription painkillers. And according to court documents, a whistleblower had found, crack pipes, bags of cocaine, prescription pills in work areas of the factory. Many of the middle-aged employees had become addicted to drugs after taking painkillers for surgery. And, one estimated that a quarter of his co-workers were abusing drugs. Now, why is this important? If you're building a precision product like an aircraft, you basically shouldn't have impaired judgment. You don't want them to be drunk. You don't want them to be on excessive painkillers. You don't want them to be in any kind of insobriety, right? And this sort of problem, I think, indicates that two things. The workforce that remains is pretty old, right? What does it mean that you get into the problems of drug addiction because you had a surgery? Well, young people don't get surgeries mostly. These are old people. These are boomers. So Boeing might be one of the first companies in the US where mass retirement of the boomers takes the company out. All these like super skilled blue collar guys not being replaced by anyone. They're barely coping, and the quality of the remaining personnel is just lower than it was 40 or 50 years ago. So I think that we do have an aspect of a competency crisis hitting Boeing. The US labor force, at least when it comes to manufacturing, engineering, so on, it's just a worse labor force than it was 50 years ago. And a lot of the meritocratic mechanisms have also been impaired. DEI is not a positive development, right? Because it forces sort of this diversity function that can override meritocracy as a corporate agenda. It's very difficult to, demonstrate competence in the field. And I think when it comes to this kind of precision manufacturing, even on the margin, promoting slightly more incompetent people than you would have otherwise really adds up. The whole process becomes very high friction, and then something is bound to go wrong. Like if you reduce the competency of the average worker at every stage of manufacturing an aircraft by like a few percent and increase the error rate by a few percent, that could be the difference between a viable aircraft production line and one that you have to shut down because 1% of the planes now crash or have like terrible errors that result in costs, delays, and repairs.
That's a great overview. Is there anything we haven't yet covered from the piece or about Boeing or Airbus that you think is worth leaving our audience with?
I've been trying to keep the numbers aspect of the brief light, though I did bring up some numbers. I warmly recommend, the listeners read the Bismarck Brief on the decline of Boeing. I think one thing that I emphasize more strongly there is that the future of U.S. aerospace could be very positive. But any company that does attempt to push against that, they will have to grapple with the general decline in industrial discipline of the American population. Industrial manufacturing requires discipline. You have to go there actually during the same hours as everyone else goes to the factory. You have to be sober. You have to be precise. You have to be efficient. You have to match the pace of your machines. And I think we believe ourselves to be a post-industrial society in a positive sense. But I think we're a post-industrial society in a negative sense. It's not that technology has advanced to the point where industrial discipline isn't needed, where a company doesn't need to be meritocratic on the factory floor, and the workers have to be actually hardworking, actually reliable, actually high integrity, and where the management actually has to have people that understand the physical realities of the manufacturing floor. It's not that we've progressed beyond that. It's that we outsourced this to China. So we pretended that we could have all the benefits of an industrial civilization by having a rival geopolitical power manufacture everything. And people made fun of Chinese low quality products, but through the course of an industrial revolution where millions of people went into factories and often worked under terrible conditions, where they were very replaceable, they have developed a culture of industrial discipline. And the US population hasn't. It's lost it, actually. This isn't as simple as a work ethic. I can call it industrial discipline for a reason. So sociologically, I would say that the US does not have a manufacturing culture. We have a culture of innovation, but we don't have a culture of building. And this will continue to be a big problem. One of the more, positive aspects of this that we can maybe hope for is that particular company founders, have managed to push against this. So people who are not a normal American executive, people who are a bit like Elon Musk, who are super disagreeable, who are willing to go into a department of an established organization and fire 90% of the people and give them basically a threatening warning saying this is now a hardcore company and we're going to prioritize excellence and quality above else. This is actually, again, NVIDIA, head of NVIDIA, Jensen is the same. That generation of people who are not managers from the manager schools, but managers who are ascended founders, they might be able to recreate that. But it will be a challenge. And I think a return to becoming a manufacturing culture is a prerequisite for American aerospace success.
That sounds like a good place to wrap, huh?
Yes. Yeah.
Samo, thank you for coming on and doing a overview of both Boeing and Airbus. This has been a great conversation, and look forward to next time.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks for listening to Live Players. Please subscribe, leave a review, and check out Samo's excellent newsletter, The Bismarck Brief, for more rigorous analysis of key individuals, institutions, or industries. Live Players is a production of Turpentine, the podcast network behind Econ 102 with Noah Smith and Moment of Zen.